All right, let's get right into it. Today, we are taking apart one of the most explosive political texts ever written, the Communist Manifesto. This is a document that has fueled revolutions, defined entire empires, and yeah, it still sparks intense debate almost 2 centuries later. Right from the get-go, the manifesto doesn't mess around. It opens with this absolutely iconic line. It's pure theater, right? It immediately frames communism not as some dry political theory, but as this unstoppable, almost ghostly force sweeping across the entire continent. It really sets the stage for a text that feels as much like a prophecy as it does a political plan. And then, bam, you get this. This is the core idea of the whole thing, packed into one sentence. Marx and Engels are basically saying, forget what you learned about history. For them, it's not about great kings or epic battles. Nope. The real engine driving everything is the constant, grinding conflict between economic classes, the people on top and the people on the bottom. And here it is, the call to arms. This is the line that takes all that historical analysis and turns it into a revolutionary rallying cry. It's this incredibly powerful, emotional pitch to the industrial working class, the proletariat, telling them, look, you have everything to gain from this revolution. It's your one shot at total freedom. With language that powerful, you can see why the manifesto feels like a bolt from the blue, right? It just seems to explode onto the scene in 1848, this completely new, totally original vision for turning the world upside down, written by a couple of singular geniuses.
But that whole bolt from the blue idea, that's the exact myth we're here to deconstruct. The real story of how the manifesto came to be is honestly way more complicated and frankly, a lot more interesting than the legend. So let's start peeling back those layers. And this is really the key question. What if the manifesto wasn't some miraculous, spontaneous creation? What if it was actually a brilliant mashup of ideas that were already floating around? And what if its authors, deliberately kind of hid their sources to make their work seem totally new and scientific?
Now this is where it gets really interesting. This shows the difference between the image Marx and Engels wanted to project and where their ideas actually came from. They basically curated their own brand. They actively erased any mention of their intellectual debts to religious traditions, to utopian socialists, to German philosophers, and even to English economists. They wanted to frame their theory as a pure, objective science, born only from the hard facts of economic reality.
So if they were following a recipe, what exactly were the ingredients? Let's break down the three main intellectual streams that Marx and Engels blended together to create their powerful new formula.
Okay, so first up, from German philosophy, they snagged this big idea that history isn't random, it has a direction, and it moves forward through conflict. Second, from the French utopian socialists, they took all these sharp critiques about the inequality of capitalism and this dream of a future built on community. And third, from English political economists, they borrowed the actual tools to analyze the nuts and bolts of how factories and markets really work.
Okay, so they had all the ingredients. But the real genius of the manifesto is how they mixed them all together. Let's dig into how this combination created their central driving idea.
And this is the result. A brand new theory they called historical materialism. The core idea is that the material world, like how we make stuff and who owns the factories, that's what determines everything else. Politics, culture, even our beliefs. History, they argued, lurches forward because of the struggle between the class that owns everything and the class that does all the work. So they took this theory and applied it across all of human history, basically reframing it as one long story of class conflict. As you can see here, they argued every era had its main fight. And for Marx and Engels, their own modern era was defined by what they saw as the final showdown, the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, versus the proletariat, the industrial workers.
All right, so that's their diagnosis of the past. But what about the future? Let's take a look at the revolutionary world the manifesto predicted would rise from the ashes of this final class struggle.
What's kind of wild is that the manifesto doesn't just condemn capitalism, it almost marvels at its revolutionary power. They describe how the constant need for profit forces the ruling class to just demolish old traditions, technologies, and social bonds. That famous phrase captures it perfectly. This idea that capitalism just dissolves the old world, and in doing so accidentally creates the perfect conditions for its own destruction. So once the working class takes over, the manifesto lays out a pretty radical to-do list for remaking society. And this isn't just about a new government. We're talking a complete re-engineering of how everything works. The goals include getting rid of private property, specifically things like factories and land, centralizing control of banks and transportation, and eventually creating a society so equal that the state itself just becomes obsolete and withers away.
Now that vision, whether you see it as a perfect dream or a total nightmare, had a world-shaking impact. So let's wrap this up by looking at the controversial and incredibly enduring legacy of this tiny but powerful book.
The impact was just staggering. Seriously, think about this number. By the middle of the 20th century, roughly 1/3 of the entire world's population lived under governments that claimed the Manifesto was their founding document. This wasn't just some idea in a book anymore, it was real life for millions.
We're talking about the Soviet Union, its Eastern European bloc, China, Cuba, and countless revolutionary movements all over the world. The ideas in the Manifesto were literally translated into state policy. It became the blueprint for single-party states and centrally planned economies, shaping the entire geopolitical map of the 20th century.
And that all brings us to the big question for today. In the 21st century, after the fall of the Soviet Union, in a world dominated by global capitalism, is the Manifesto just a dusty old relic? Or, in an age where we're all grappling with massive wealth inequality, does its critique of capitalism still give us a vital way to understand the world we're living in right now?
The Manifesto itself doesn't end with a question, though. It ends with an exclamation point, a final, unambiguous command that has echoed through history, inspiring movements for generations. It's a fittingly powerful end to a text that, for better or for worse, absolutely changed the world.